seen rising food prices help spark political revolutions. But could all of that only be the beginning? Where rising prices and food shortages were once temporary, driven by perhaps unusual weather, fixed by countries like the U.S., who could serve like global buffers, the problem may now become unstoppable. Population growth, rising consumption, decreasing water supplies, deteriorating soil. They're all part of the geopolitics of food. So what do we do to avoid mass conflict and inequality? Or is it too late? Joining me to discuss this is Lester Brown, president of the Earth Policy Institute, author of the book World on the Edge, How to Prevent Environmental and Economic Collapse. He also has the cover story in Foreign Policy magazine out for May and June, titled The New Geopolitics of Food. Lester, thank you so much for being here tonight.
My pleasure.
Let's talk about how rising food prices and the shortages that we're seeing today, how they might become permanent staples, not just something that goes away.
Well, we're seeing record growth in demand. As you mentioned, population growth, people moving up the food chain, probably 3 billion of them. More and more grain going to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. Then water shortages, climate change on the supply side of the equation. Farmers are scrambling now. This was to be a year of stock rebuilding because last year we had the Russian heat wave and a huge loss there. Stocks dropped worldwide about 50 million tons, which is very substantial. And now we have this year with great prices at planting time, but for one reason or another, we're probably going to see not only not a rebuilding of stocks, but a further decline of stocks. So then we'll be trying to make it to next year's harvest. Again, living on the edge. It's getting a little dicey out there.
Is there a breaking point?
These tipping points or breaking points are difficult to anticipate. We know that rising food prices have played some role in North Africa and the Middle East and the political unrest there. It's not always easy to tell exactly how much. But we also know that rising food prices create political instability and eventually failing states. And that's one of my concerns, is that the number of failing states gets longer and longer. We know the number of hungry people in the world is increasing. It was going down for decades, but then the last several years it's been going up. And there's nothing in place to stop that rise.
But if we look at the moves that certain countries are making, does that also give us a signal that they're aware that this might start some kind of conflict, that this is something they need to start preparing for? You can look at China, you can look at Saudi Arabia, South Korea. They're starting to buy up pieces of land in other countries so they can produce their own grain.
Yeah, this land grabbing is a huge thing. All these land acquisitions, which is what the diplomats call them, or land grabs, which is what the NGOs call them, who are opposing them. But huge areas now, worldwide, a World Bank tabulation indicates that the area of land acquisitions in other countries now exceeds the area in wheat and corn combined in the United States. So it's not trivial.
So what happens to those local populations?
A lot of them get displaced. Their governments just sell huge chunks of land. I mean, it's not as though there aren't villagers there, but in court, villagers don't have title. They've been living there for generations on the same plots of, farming the same plots of land. They don't have a document they can take to a court and say, this is mine. And so a lot of governments are accepting the money from foreign investors and just pushing them aside.
And one thing I thought was really interesting in your piece of foreign policy that you wrote is that civilization can still survive without oil, but we can't go on without our soil. Can you go further into that?
Well, we're losing a lot of topsoil worldwide because of overplowing. We're plowing land that's highly erodible, vulnerable to wind erosion. We see this in China, a huge dust bowl forming there. We see it in Central Africa, another one there. Both these dust bowls are far larger than the U.S. dust bowl in the 1930s. But another big problem is water shortages. And that, I think, is going to have a major effect on efforts to expand food production. We see Saudi Arabia, wheat production in free fall now because they've depleted their one aquifer underground source of water. So I think we're moving into, I mean, most of the last half century has been an era of abundance and even surpluses. Now I think we're moving into an era of scarcity. And I don't think we've yet quite grasped the meaning of all this.
And is that undoubtedly going to cause more unrest? Are we going to see the Arab Spring continue to spread? I mean, could we ever see protests like this happen in the United States, you could say that we really haven't felt the effect of high food prices yet. They're just more of an annoyance and inconvenience for us. It's not a life or death situation. Or will countries like the United States, the developed nations that have their own grain supplies, are they going to be the ones that are okay, that start cutting off that supply to the rest of the world?
The problem is we have one world food economy now, and if we have high prices in the world market, everyone is affected by it. It's not as though we could isolate ourselves. And the tricky thing for us is the Chinese are probably going to be coming into the U.S. market for potentially massive quantities of grain in the not too distant future. And the idea that American consumers, we can be competing with 1.4 billion Chinese consumers with rapidly rising incomes for our grain harvest, driving up our food prices, is something I don't think most Americans are quite prepared for.
Well, it sure doesn't sound like it. It's a bit of a scary thought, actually, to think about it.